Hello, my friends. My name is Gerdes, and I do these daily updates on Ukraine. If you're not familiar with me, please consider subscribing. And if you are, hit that like button to tell the YouTube algorithm that other people need to hear this. So here's what we're going to talk about today. There's two major themes and then a few smaller sub-themes. So the first is more about the missile strike in Makiivka. The second is Russians being angry at the military, not at Ukraine, but at their own military because of this. Then we're going to talk about propaganda and free speech and the tension that's there. We're going to talk about citizens who would overthrow Putin in a documentary. We will talk about why an Iron Dome will not work in Ukraine. We're going to have some fun with Russian state media, as we normally do, and then we'll talk about the Trump card, and you don't want to miss all this. So thank you for coming, and I appreciate that you care about Ukraine. Before we begin, we're going to start here, and here is a comment in yesterday's video. So I'm going to scroll down. I'm going to show you two. So John Boy 4963 said, notice that there were no reports of wounded at nearby hospitals. Well, that's interesting. I haven't seen reports that were or were not, so I can't really speak to that, but that's a really interesting thing. John, you're thinking that's really good. But the winning comment was this. Whenever Russia gives a number, add a zero. Now, that's not really good math. That's really kind of a rough cut, but the idea is right, that they always show that they're more awesome than they otherwise would let on. So my comment was, you win. Congratulations, right side, 1911. You had the best comment. Okay, let's keep moving. We're going to start with this. What we know about what happened in this, like this was the missile strike attack, that there's not a lot of people that could survive this kind of thing. 6 missiles and munitions below. I mean, it just totaled the thing. So, but there are some comments in this that I want to show you. So let me scroll down just a little bit. As expected, the blame for what happened in Makiivka began to be blamed on the mobilized soldiers themselves. You see, they turned on their phones and got spotted, wrote Grey Zone, a Telegram channel linked to the Wagner Group. Grey Zone went on to blame the commanders as well for lodging large numbers of soldiers in a building vulnerable to artillery fire. Okay, I can see this, the latter. Sergei Moronov, leader of the Kremlin-loyal party in Russia's parliament, said that an investigation was necessary to determine whether treachery or criminal negligence was behind the strike. Like, they're really upset. I mean, upset like when the Crimean Bridge was hit. Okay. Euronews, the same kind of article. Russia anger grows over strike that killed dozens of troops in Ukraine. I'm just going to read a little bit here. Russian nationalists and some lawmakers have demanded punishment for the commanders accused of ignoring the dangers as anger grew over the deaths of Russian soldiers of the Ukraine's war's deadliest strike. Okay, another one. Al Jazeera. In a rare show of criticism, Russian nationalists and lawmakers demand punishment for Russian commanders over the deadly January 1 attack in occupied Makiivka. So there's a lot of this same kind of sentiment, and you're hearing it from various angles, and so there's something legitimate there. When you're hearing things from various angles, please pay attention, because that's usually a sign that something is truer. Now, this was the article in the Moscow Times, which is independent news. It is not Russian state media, but they said this. They were talking about pro-war bloggers suggesting that the actual number could be something more like 400 fatalities, and that's coming from pro-war bloggers. They came out to lay roses. An Orthodox priest recited a prayer. Grief unites us, they're talking about. And together we're going to destroy the enemy. And then they quoted this. We haven't been given a choice. Neither us nor our husbands wanted the war, but the West closed ranks against us. They're repeating Russian propaganda points. Like, that's what they sincerely believe. And that's so tragic. Okay, and so let's talk about propaganda and how propaganda works. Zelensky just signed a new law that could allow Ukrainian government to block news websites. That makes me a little bit nervous, okay? So, again, remember, I'm an American. I come with certain assumptions, but the Founding Fathers, and I did my doctoral dissertation on the American Founding Fathers, understood that when you lose one freedom, those freedoms are tied to others. So you can't lose freedom of speech without it affecting your liberty and your movement, or lose your freedom of religion without it affecting the other freedoms, right? And so this makes me kind of nervous, but I understand the context that we're in as well. I mean, it is in martial law, and so I just let's hear what the article says, and then you can see what you think. A new law signed by Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky could give Ukraine's government powers to block media outlets. Lawmakers have touted the bill as an effort to bring Ukraine's media laws closer to the European Union standards. However, that's not what the media folks think. The organizations representing journalists say that the law will erode press freedoms in Ukraine. Now, you got to be careful. You don't want news reporters going places that are going to get people killed. But at the same time, just listen. The law is at odds with freedoms given to the press in other parts of Europe, the European Federation of Journalists said. The version that Zelensky signed on Thursday is not as sweeping as the previous draft, which the Federation called worthy of the worst authoritarian regimes. Like, that's not where you want to be. In February 2022, Ukraine has introduced changes to how the media operates. In March, for instance, Zelensky signed off on combining the country's national television channels into a single platform. And I remember when that happened, and I was upset with that at the time as well. So there's a fine line between restricting people's freedom of speech and then allowing bad things to happen because of the abuse of that speech. And we see that to a smaller or lesser degree with laws about profanity, for example, in the United States, or the sexual content on TV, or something along those lines. But here, this is writ large because now you're dealing with like human lives potentially being impacted, people being killed. Okay, now with that being said, I thought this was an interesting juxtaposition right next to it. Pro-Putin operatives in Germany are working to turn Berlin against Ukraine because they're using that same freedom of speech. We must stop being vassals of the Americans, right-wing German politician Markus Bischt said from a makeshift stage in the back of a truck. The crowd clapped and waved in Russian and German flags. Now, that's a Putin propaganda point. Vassals of the Americans? What's he talking about? Well, that's what Putin repeats again and again. Here's a anti-war protest in Germany. If Germany, the European Union's biggest economy, turns its back on Kyiv, the European unity over the war will fracture, they say. And I think, I got to give Putin credit, or those in Russia thinking about trying to do this informational war. That is a brilliant wedge to try to, if they can carve out Germany and push Germany or France or some other large European country away, they're not going to push the United States over very easily. Canada, certainly not. There's a huge Ukrainian population there. UK, probably not either. I mean, those are probably the three of the stronger large factions. They're not going to do it with the Baltic states. They're too small. They're not going to do it with Poland. They're too close. But if they can wedge Germany, that's pretty amazing. Reuters found that some of the loudest agitators for change in German policy have two faces. Some use aliases and have undisclosed ties to Russia and Russian entities and international sanctions or to far-right organizations. So with that being said, if you're trying to, here's free speech and then here is tightening up, where's the line? I'm not exactly sure, but I know that there's a real problem here. What you don't want to do is get your freedom and have your freedom be so mired by how you've gotten your freedom. I want them to have their freedom, but I want them to have their full freedom as well. And I just find it troubling. So I'm letting you know what's going on here. Okay, now this was also really interesting on the flip side of that. It's not his country, it's ours. The Russian partisans at war with the Kremlin. Yeah, I've said before, it's not the people that are going to subvert or, rise up and demand Putin's overthrow, but there is a small fraction of people, just regular people, not oligarchs. Oligarchs are his real danger because that's his power base. If the oligarchs turn against Putin, as a group, as individuals, they'll get thrown off a balcony. As a group, if they turn against Putin, they can overthrow him. But the people are not likely to rise up. But there's a small group of people that actually are anti-Putin and they understand the times. But a new documentary by British filmmaker Jake Hanahan suggests that a large-scale active resistance inside Russia is now being waged by Russia's own citizens. There's this thing like, well, it must be the CIA, another Putin propaganda point, but that's not it. How about some Russians are genuinely so sick of Putin that they're going to do something about it? And this is the video. There's a link to it in here, and I'll put the link in the description below if you want to see it. It's Russia Anti-Putin Underground, and I'll put that in the description below. I've not watched it yet. I'm planning to. But it goes on a little bit and it says the men told the filmmakers that they're risking their lives because it's not Putin's country, it's our country. Right. That's exactly right. And added, if not now, when? That's a great question. But what was really interesting was the last line of this entire thing. Some of these people on Twitter are giddy, he says. They're getting away with xenophobia like they never could. quote, all Russians are orcs. And I've seen that kind of thing and I understand the sentiment. But again, it's not everyone. There's a huge faction that are in that camp, but it's not everyone. Well, actually, no. Some of them are taking the biggest risk of their bleeping lives to help Russians that they are never going to meet and will never know. And I mean, that says a lot. I think that's fair. And so I'm looking forward to the documentary. I'd be curious about what your thoughts are. And let's move on to the next topic. Okay, Interfax Ukraine. It's impossible to create an iron dome over Ukraine in coming years. So Zelensky wanted to close the airspace, but that became a problem kind of thing, like that could draw the West into World War III. Well, how about an iron dome? Well, the iron dome that covers Israel works because it's Israel. It's small enough. They need things like fighter jets as well as anti-aircraft. There's just not enough anti-aircraft defense systems that could make an iron dome an iron dome. Think about it like this. Ukraine is approximately the size of Texas. I mean, if you look at the square miles, and I'm American, so I'm talking in miles as opposed to kilometers, but the square miles of Israel is closer to New Hampshire. And so you're really comparing apples to oranges. So the Iron Dome kind of scenario won't actually work out. Now, this I thought was really interesting, and I'm just flashing you the headline. I'm not going to go into it, but Germany is open to seizing Russian assets to help Ukraine rebuild. And they were talking about how they're going to have a Marshall Plan after the war. It's going to have to be bigger than a Marshall Plan, actually. Germany is open to using billions of euros in frozen Russian assets to help Ukraine rebuild as long as legal issues can be resolved. And it goes on a little bit further where they're talking about how the damage is dramatic. It will cost billions and require the entire global community to help develop reasonable solutions. The German chancellor told reporters it will be a big task that has little to do with the Marshall Plan. It will be bigger. That's right, it will be. Now, I don't know whether they should, seize the German assets or just use oil revenue. That would be my take. Just use oil revenue. It's nationalized anyway. Let that be how they're going to repay for things. But one way or another, but this is a positive sign that Germany would be on board with this. Okay, this is CBS News. Ukraine says that Russia plans to retaliate for deadly strike on military base with prolonged drone attack. Well, they've been doing it and doing it. Nothing to see here. We can move on to fun with Russian state media. Okay, our first article goes back to what we talked about yesterday. Remember I talked about how Zelensky has met with 22 African nations since the war began? Well, here's RT talking about how Angola, the resource-rich African nation, has called on Russian businesses to invest in the country's economy, pledging full diplomatic support for new initiatives. Now, there's going to be more diplomatic support than just the initiatives. I mean, if they're bringing Russia in as a partner, Russia's going to want them to vote their way in the UN. And the more small little nations that they can accumulate on their side, that's why Zelensky was brilliant playing chess as opposed to checkers. And that's what I was talking about yesterday. So if you haven't seen that, go back and watch that and you'll understand what I'm talking about. Okay, here's another one. HIMARS. U.S.-made HIMARS destroyed in Russian new strikes, according to RT. Russian forces have destroyed several U.S.-supplied HIMARS rocket launchers and eliminated scores of Ukrainian troops and dozens of foreign fighters in a fresh series of missile strikes, Moscow's defense ministry said today. Well, okay. They just have this, like, HIMAR-phobia. In fact, I looked it up just out of curiosity. How many times HIMARS were mentioned here? 272 mentions of HIMARS. We're only on day 314, and HIMARS didn't even actually get to the fight until early summer. So they really are like HIMAR-phobic, if I can create that phrase. So if you're still here, please give me a like so the YouTube algorithm will spread this. Drop a comment if you have a question. I read every question. And if you want to support the channel, buy me a coffee. Thanks for your time. Thank you for caring about Ukraine.